These three true hospital horror stories are inspired by true events, following a handful of hospital workers who discovered that not all patients are there to be healed. A diligent nurse questions her sanity after seeing a visitor step out of a patient's room, a man who couldn't possibly have been there. A pragmatic nurse in a notoriously haunted sanatorium discovers the terrifying truth behind the hauntings is tied directly to her most harmless-looking patient. And a night shift janitor learns that in the quietest hours of the hospital, death doesn't just happen. It arrives and waits. A hospital is a place of healing, but sometimes the sickness isn't in the patients. It's in the walls. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what's coming for you next. The year was 1990. The Danvers State Hospital was a place that held on to the past. Even on the active geriatric ward, you could feel the weight of the main asylum nearby, a massive brick shadow full of grim stories. Riley, a night nurse, was too busy to pay much attention to the building's reputation. For her, the long, sterile corridors were just a workplace. The strange noises were just old pipes, and the flickering lights were just bad wiring. You had to think that way, or a place like this could get into your head. One of her patients, a frail woman named Kennedy, was a prime example of the ward's sad reality. She was a sweet soul, but her mind often drifted. Her favorite topic was her husband, Drew. She spoke of him in the present tense, as if he might walk through the door any minute, despite having been told he was long gone. Riley found it tragic, but harmless. A comforting story the mind tells itself to survive. The shift was dragging. As Riley pushed her supply cart, her mind was on the mountain of paperwork waiting for her. She barely noticed the strange, rhythmic pulse of a light fixture down the hall. A door up ahead clicked shut, a sound that should have been impossible on an empty corridor, but she dismissed it. As she got closer to Kennedy's room, an old man in a dark, old-fashioned suit stepped out. Riley glanced up, her eyes briefly scanning him. Odd, she thought. Family isn't supposed to be here this late. He was pale and thin, and kept his head down as he walked past with a stiff, formal gait before disappearing around a corner. She felt a brief flash of curiosity. Who could that be? But the thought was quickly replaced by the next item on her checklist. She pushed open Kennedy's door. "Everything all right in here?" she asked, her voice carrying a practiced cheerfulness. The room was quiet except for the soft beep of the monitor. Kennedy was sitting up, a wide, happy smile on her face. It was the most lucid Riley had seen her in weeks. "I saw you had a visitor," Riley said, checking the chart. "Yes," Kennedy sighed happily. "That was my husband. That was Drew." Riley smiled back. It was one of Kennedy's good nights then, lost in a pleasant memory. "Well," she said warmly, "that's very nice of him to stop by and see you." She fluffed Kennedy's pillow, made a note on the chart, and left the room, leaving the old woman beaming. The encounter left Riley feeling a little sad for the sweet, confused woman. Later, as the sun threatened to rise, Riley was at the nurse's station, finishing her notes. Carol, the head nurse, a woman who had seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it, was sipping burnt coffee beside her. "Kennedy had a good night," Riley mentioned casually, not looking up from her paperwork. She was so convinced her husband came to visit. She was just glowing. "I even saw the man who set her off, an old guy in a suit leaving her room. Must have been a brother or a cousin who looks like him." Carol stopped stirring her coffee. The small scraping sound of the spoon ceased. The silence made Riley look up. The older nurse was staring at her, her face drained of all color. "What did he look like?" Carol's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I don't know," Riley said a little defensively. "Old, thin, wore a dark suit. Why?" Carol pushed her coffee cup away and leaned forward, her eyes locked on Riley's. "Kennedy doesn't have any brothers. She doesn't have any family that visits, period. Not for 10 years. A cold feeling started to creep up Riley's spine. "It must have been another patient's visitor who got lost," she offered, but her voice lacked conviction. Carol shook her head slowly. "Riley," she said, her voice grim. "Her husband Drew. He was a patient in the main asylum. He died there, on a cold winter night in 1958. The words hung in the air. Riley stared at Carol, her mind frantically trying to process what she'd just heard. The casual, curious glance at the man in the hallway suddenly replayed in her mind, but this time it was terrifying. The out-of-style suit, the pale, blank face, the stiff, unnatural way he moved. It wasn't a lost visitor. It wasn't a relative. It was the quiet, happy delusion of a sweet old lady, given flesh and bone, walking the halls of a place that refused to let go of its dead. The shift wasn't over. For Riley, it felt like it would never be over. In the 1950s, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium was a city unto itself, a sprawling Gothic giant on a Kentucky hill. Its purpose was to house the dying. The air inside was a character in the story, a permanent blend of harsh antiseptic and the sweet, sickly scent of decay that seeped from the walls themselves. Long corridors, tiled in drab institutional green, stretched into the distance, and the most common sound was the constant muffled chorus of coughing from behind heavy wooden doors. This was the world Nurse Rose, a practical, no-nonsense woman stepped into. She'd heard the ghost stories from other nurses, whispers of shadows and voices, but she dismissed them as the tired ramblings of an overworked staff in a sad place. Her assignment was the 5th floor, the highest level of the hospital and the heart of its darkest legends. Her primary patient was in room 502, an old woman named Elizabeth. To Rose, Elizabeth was simply a case study in tragedy. Frail, quiet, and seemingly lost to the world, a harmless patient in a room with a bad reputation. The floor's physician, Dr. Price, was the one who first challenged her pragmatism. He was a good doctor, but his scientific mind had been worn down by years of unexplained events. He pulled Rose aside during her first week, his face etched with a seriousness that was impossible to ignore. "I want to warn you about that room, nurse," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last winter, during a night shift, a full metal bedpan slid off a shelf and hovered in the air for a solid second before it crashed to the floor. No one was within 10 feet of it. The history of this place is alive in that room, and it is not friendly. Do your job, but never, ever turn your back on an empty corner." His words, coming from a man of medicine, planted a seed of unease in Rose's mind. She tried to ignore it, but the floor seemed intent on making her a believer. She began to notice the cold spot just outside Elizabeth's door. It wasn't a draft. It was a patch of dead, icy air that seemed to suck the warmth right out of her body whenever she passed through it. Then came the weeping. It was a woman's cry, soft and full of sorrow, that would begin without warning on the quietest nights. Rose would walk the entire length of the echoing hall, checking on other patients, only to find them sleeping soundly. The sound seemed to come from nowhere, a phantom grief that had nowhere to go. The scraping began a week later. Rose was at the nurse's station late one night, finishing her charts under the dim glow of a desk lamp. A faint sound made her pause. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a dry, methodical noise, like fingernails being dragged across wood. She tried to dismiss it as a tree branch against a window, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was coming from the direction of room 502. She walked down the hall, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the tile, and stood outside the door, listening. The sound was clearer now, coming from inside. Taking a breath, she pushed the door open. The scraping stopped. In the dim light from the hallway, she could see Elizabeth, perfectly still in her bed, seemingly fast asleep. For weeks, this was Rose's reality. The cold, the weeping, the scraping. She was living in a ghost story, and her professional skepticism was eroding into genuine fear. The shift began with a detail so small it was almost nothing. One morning, Rose was providing Elizabeth her daily care, gently cleaning her hands with a warm cloth. As she wiped the patient's palms, she noticed something under her fingernails. They were tiny, almost microscopic, splinters of dark oak. Her eyes darted to the heavy headboard of the bed, its wood a perfect match. A logical clinical observation crashed into her supernatural fears. That night she heard the weeping again, but this time the elevator at the end of the hall dinged loudly, and the crying instantly ceased. A ghost wouldn't be startled by an elevator. Rose's fear didn't vanish. It transformed. It became colder, sharper. She started observing Elizabeth not as a patient, but as a suspect. She began to listen more closely to the old woman's mumblings in her sleep. They were always the same fragments of a memory, a nightmare on a loop. "The needle was so cold," Elizabeth would whisper, her face tense. "He told me to hold still. Stop it, doctor. Please, stop it." The final piece of the puzzle, the one that broke all sense, happened in plain sight. Rose was walking past the room when she saw Elizabeth, who she'd helped into her chair that morning, drop a book. It landed in the small gap between her bed and the heavy, iron-framed nightstand. Rose started to go in and help, but she stopped, hidden by the doorway. She watched as Elizabeth, without a word, placed one frail-looking hand on the nightstand. With a low groan of metal on tile, she pushed the heavy object a full 6 inches. There was no strain on her face, no struggle. It was an act of casual, impossible strength. Rose felt her blood run cold. She had scientific proof of a hoax, yet she had just witnessed a physical act that seemed to defy science itself. She had to know the truth. That night, under the guise of taking a break, Rose slipped back into room 502. She settled into a chair in the darkest corner, slowed her breathing, and waited. The minutes stretched into an hour. Then, in the deep silence, came the rustle of sheets. Rose opened her eyes a crack. Elizabeth was getting out of bed. She didn't move like a sick old woman. She moved with a silent, fluid agility, her steps quick and sure, her body filled with the energy of someone decades younger. Rose watched, paralyzed, as Elizabeth executed her routine. First, she crept to the window, opening it just a fraction to let the cold night air stream in, feeding the cold spot. Then, she returned to the bed and, with a look of intense concentration, began to drag her fingernails down the oak headboard, creating the sound that had haunted the nurses for months. Finally, she let out a low, mournful whimper, a perfect, practiced imitation of a weeping ghost. It was a meticulous, chilling performance. When it was done, Elizabeth turned, scanning the room as if taking a bow. Her eyes, sharp and clear, landed on Rose in the corner. She knew she was caught. The air grew thick and heavy. A slow, knowing smile spread across Elizabeth's face, but the expression was alien. The look in her eyes was not one of a confused old woman. It was ancient, intelligent, and brimming with a cold, triumphant malice that did not belong to her. In that moment, Rose felt she was no longer looking at Elizabeth. but at the thing that was wearing her body like a costume. Rose left Waverly Hills the next week. The question was a poison for which there was no antidote. Was Elizabeth a victim of profound trauma, her rage granting her moments of inexplicable strength as she played the part of a ghost? Or was her trauma the very key that had unlocked the door, hollowing her out and making her the perfect willing vessel for the true malevolent spirit of room 502? She would never know. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Jordan was used to the quiet of the hospital's third floor. Working the night shift in Manchester, Vermont, meant that silence was just part of the job. The only real sounds came from the work itself: the squeak of shoes on the clean floor, the back and forth slide of the mop head spreading cleaning fluid. Sometimes the wind would push against the windows, a low whistle from the outside world, but inside, it was always still. For Jordan, this was normal. It was predictable, and after months of doing this work, it was just the way things were. But this particular night felt different. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. Jordan was mopping down the main corridor, the lights overhead giving off a low, steady buzz. That buzz and the sound of the mop were the only things to hear. The light cast a clean, white glare on the floor, making every shadow in the doorway seem darker and deeper. Pushing her cleaning cart, Jordan passed room 314. The door wasn't fully shut. A line of warm light from inside stretched across the hallway floor. That was odd. At this time of night, nearly all the patient rooms were dark. Jordan stopped working for a second. It wasn't about being nosy. It was just something out of the ordinary. She walked over to the door and looked through the opening. Inside, an old woman named Agnes was lying in the bed. She was just a still shape under a blanket, but there was someone else in there too. In the corner of the room, in a wooden rocking chair, sat another old woman. The light from the bedside lamp was dim, but Jordan could see her clearly. She had white hair, and her hands were resting in her lap. She just sat there, looking at the patient in the bed. Jordan figured it was a family member. It happened sometimes. A wife or a daughter would stay late, keeping watch. From the room, Jordan could hear a steady, quiet sound. It was the rocking chair, creaking back and forth. A soft, even noise. It seemed peaceful enough. Jordan watched for a moment, then went back to the cart and continued mopping down the hall. A few minutes passed. Jordan finished the end of the corridor, turned the cart around, and started working her way back. As she got closer to room 314, she noticed the light was still on, but the sound was gone. The rocking chair had stopped creaking. The absence of that one small sound made the entire hallway feel wrong. The air itself seemed to go still, growing thick and heavy, pressing in. A strange, prickling sensation ran up Jordan's arms, the feeling of static in the air before a lightning strike, making the fine hairs stand on end. Something was definitely off. Jordan stopped the cart and walked to the door, pushing it open a little more to look inside. The patient, Agnes, hadn't moved. The wooden rocking chair in the corner was empty. The room was completely silent, but it was a pressurized, uncomfortable silence that made Jordan's ears feel full. She took a step into the room, and the strange, electric feeling in the air grew stronger. It was concentrated in the corner, right where the chair had been sitting. The air there felt thick, almost solid. A bad feeling started to build. Jordan walked over to the bed. Hesitantly, she reached out and put a hand on Agnes's shoulder to check on her. The woman's skin was cold. Not just cool, but unnaturally cold and hard. It was a shock. Jordan realized in that instant that Agnes wasn't sleeping. She was dead, and from the feel of it, She had been for some time. Jordan's heart started pounding. She backed out of the room and ran down the hallway, her feet making loud slapping sounds on the clean floor. She found the night nurse, Kimberly, at her desk filling out paperwork. She looked up as Jordan ran over, out of breath. Jordan told her everything that had just happened, finding Agnes, the woman in the chair, and how the woman was now gone. Kimberly listened to the whole story without interrupting. Her face was calm, but her eyes looked tired and sad. When Jordan was done, she took a long breath. "I just checked the visitor logs," Kimberly said, her voice quiet. "No one has signed in for Agnes for over 6 hours." She looked right at Jordan. "Listen, you're not the first person who's seen her. The woman in the chair. I've heard that story from 3 other people over the years. I didn't know what to think at first, but after a while, you just have to accept that some things don't have an explanation." A deep, unshakable dread filled Jordan. This wasn't some visitor who had slipped past the front desk. This wasn't a ghost. It was something else entirely. It was a presence that showed up when people were dying. It sat with them. It waited. And Jordan had just walked in and seen it doing its job. It was a part of this place, a part of what happened here, and it was never meant to be seen. After that night, the hospital was never the same for Jordan. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was menacing. Every dark room she had to clean, she felt like she wasn't alone. The silence felt like it was watching. Jordan couldn't shake the idea that in any room, at any time, that chair could be there, with that woman just waiting. She had learned a terrible truth, that death wasn't just something that happened. It was something that arrived. Jordan's last night on the job came a few weeks later. She was in a storage room on the 2nd floor, a place full of old beds and equipment covered in dust. She finished cleaning up and went to turn off the light. Just as her hand reached for the switch, she heard a noise. It came from the far corner of the room, the part that the single light bulb didn't reach. It was a quiet, rhythmic sound. Creak, creak, creak. Jordan froze, hand hovering in the air. Her breathing felt loud in the small room. She stared into the darkness, trying to see what was making the noise. As her eyes adjusted, she could just make out a shape in the shadows. It was a wooden rocking chair. It was moving back and forth, all on its own. It was empty. The real horror hit Jordan then. She knew the chair wasn't there for her. She had overheard the nurses talking earlier. An ambulance was on its way with a critical patient. The chair was here for the new arrival. It was just getting ready. It was waiting.